The first thing Captain Elias Voss noticed was the scent. It wasn't the metallic tang of his damaged ship, nor the acrid smell of burning circuits. It was something else entirely. Fresh, alive, wild. The air around him was thick with the aroma of damp earth, blooming flowers, and something almost sweet. Elias tried to move, but he couldn't. His arms and legs were bound. Thick, twisting vines had wrapped around him, tight but not crushing. He could feel them pulsing, as if alive, shifting ever so slightly as they adjusted to his weight. He slowly opened his eyes. The world around him glowed. Deep emerald leaves shimmered under strange bioluminescent lights. Towering trees stretched into a sky of deep violet, their branches weaving together like a living cathedral. Strange plants pulsed with gentle light, their colors shifting between blue and gold. He wasn't in his ship anymore. A low hum echoed through the air, rhythmic and constant, like the planet itself was breathing. The jungle was alive, watching him. But Elias didn't panic. This was exactly where he wanted to be. The crash. Hours earlier, Elias had been piloting his scout ship toward Cytheria 9, a planet marked as restricted by the Terran corporate authority. No trade, no settlements, no interference. It had been this way for decades, ever since humanity's first disastrous attempt to harvest its resources. But Elias had no intention of plundering the planet. He had come for answers. He had read the old reports, studied the forgotten records. Long ago, a human scientist had lived here. Dr. Adrian Voss, his ancestor. The man had written about something incredible, something that had changed him forever. But then, the records had abruptly stopped. No explanation, no closure, just silence. Elias had searched for years, trying to understand what had happened. Now he had finally arrived, only to be shot down. His ship's warning systems had screamed at him moments before impact. A pulse of energy from the surface had fried his controls, sending him into a deadly spiral. He had fought against gravity, steering as best he could, before crashing into the jungle canopy. Then, darkness. Now he was awake. And he was caught. The vines held him still. Elias took a deep breath, keeping his heartbeat steady. He could feel the vines tightening slightly, sensing his movements. It was like they were testing him. Most people would have struggled. Most people would have panicked. Elias did neither. Instead, he relaxed. He let his muscles go slack, showing that he wasn't a threat. The vines hesitated, then loosened just slightly. They're intelligent, he realized. A rustling sound made him turn his head. Something was coming. From the shadows of the glowing jungle, figures emerged, tall, silent, watching. The Veilthera. They were beautiful and strange, humanoid in form, but woven from vines, bark, and petals. Their skin shimmered with bioluminescence, shifting as they moved. Their eyes glowed softly, like distant stars. Some had sharp, curling thorns along their arms. Others had delicate flowers blooming along their bodies. And at the center of them all stood her. She was taller than the rest, her form more elegant, regal. Vines wrapped around her body like living armor, and from her head, long tendrils of silver-white leaves cascaded like hair. When she stepped forward, the jungle itself seemed to shift with her, as if bowing to her presence. Elias knew who she was. Lady Sylvain, the matriarch of the Veilthera. She looked down at him, her glowing green eyes unreadable. Then she spoke. "You should not be here." Her voice was unlike anything Elias had ever heard. Not quite human, not quite alien. It was soft but firm, carrying the weight of centuries. The vines around him tightened again, as if reacting to her words. But Elias didn't flinch. He met her gaze, steady and calm. "I came here on purpose," he said. Sylvain tilted her head slightly. The vines twitched. The other Veilthera murmured in their own language, their melodic voices blending with the hum of the jungle. They didn't understand. No human ever came here willingly. No human ever surrendered to the vines. But Elias had. And he wasn't done yet. Lady Sylvain studied the human before her. His body was bound, held firmly by the living vines, yet he did not struggle. That was unusual. Most intruders fought against the jungle, against the Valethera. But this one had surrendered. His eyes met hers, not with fear, not with defiance, but with something else entirely. Purpose. You came here on purpose, she repeated, her voice smooth and flowing like wind through the leaves. The jungle pulsed softly around them, as if listening. Elias Voss gave a slight nod. Yes. Murmurs spread through the gathered Valethera. Their glowing eyes flickered with confusion. No human had willingly set foot on Cytheria 9 in decades. The last time their species had met, it had ended in blood and fire. Sylvain stepped closer. The vines around Elias shifted, adjusting to her presence. She observed him carefully. The strange armor-like suit he wore, the torn fabric where his crash had damaged it, the small scratches on his face. He was injured, but not afraid. Why? She asked. Elias exhaled. He knew he had only one chance to explain himself, and every word mattered. I came looking for the truth. Sylvain narrowed her eyes. The truth. He nodded again. About my ancestor, Dr. Adrian Voss. At that name, something changed. The jungle seemed to pause. The murmuring Valethera fell silent. The vines holding Elias pulsed once, as if in recognition. Sylvain's gaze sharpened. She knew that name. They all did. The forgotten name. Dr. Adrian Voss. A human who had come to their world long ago, before the war, before the betrayal. He had not come with weapons or greed. He had come with curiosity. Unlike the others of his kind, he had listened. He had learned. He had respected the jungle. And then he had disappeared. The Terran authorities had claimed he was dead. But the Valethera had never found his body, never seen his final moments. His fate had remained a mystery, until now. This human bore his name. Sylvain's fingers twitched, and the vines around Elias loosened just slightly. Not enough to set him free, but enough to show she was listening. You are his blood. It was not a question. Elias nodded. He was my great-grandfather. The jungle whispered around them, vines curling through the air like unseen hands. The Valethera exchanged glances, unreadable expressions passing between them. Sylvain studied Elias again, her gaze piercing. And what do you seek? Elias took a slow breath. I want to know what happened to him. Sylvain's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a stiffness, a hesitation. The air between them grew heavier, charged with something unseen. She knew. She knew something about Adrian Voss. Elias could see it in her eyes. But before she could answer, a sharp sound cut through the air. A distant howl. A warning. The Valethera stiffened. Their glowing eyes flickered, their petal-like armor shifting slightly as they turned toward the sound. The jungle around them responded, vines tightening, leaves curling inward. Something was coming. The unseen threat. Sylvain's gaze snapped back to Elias. In an instant, she made a decision. Bring him. The vines shifted again, pulling Elias forward but keeping him bound. The Valethera moved swiftly, their bodies blending into the jungle as they retreated deeper into the glowing forest. Elias didn't resist. He let the vines guide him. Let the jungle carry him forward. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. As they moved, the air grew colder. The glowing plants dimmed. The deep hum of the jungle faltered. Elias saw movement in the shadows. Something large, something wrong. And then, for the first time since waking up, he felt fear. The jungle felt different now. Elias could sense it, even through the vines that still held him. The air had turned cold, the gentle hum of life replaced by something heavier, something unnatural. The glowing flora that once bathed the jungle in warm light had dimmed, as if shrinking away from whatever was approaching. The Valethera moved swiftly, their forms blending with the twisting vines and massive trees. Elias was carried with them, the living tendrils adjusting his position as they traveled deeper into the jungle. He didn't resist. Whatever had caused that distant howl, he didn't want to face it unprepared. Sylvain walked at the front of the group, her glowing green eyes sharp and focused. She had said nothing since ordering his capture, but Elias could tell her mind was working. She knew something about his ancestor, but now was not the time to ask. Another distant howl echoed through the trees, closer this time. The Veilthera around Elias tensed. Some of them let out low, musical tones, almost like a warning call. The jungle itself seemed to respond, leaves rustling in unseen wind, vines tightening around tree trunks like clenched fists. Elias turned his head slightly, trying to get a glimpse of what was behind them. At first, he saw nothing, just the massive ancient trees stretching into the dark sky, just the glow of bioluminescent plants flickering like dying embers. Then, the shadows moved. Something large and wrong shifted between the trees, just beyond the edge of the dim light. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't like the Veilthera. This thing didn't belong here. A revenant. He had read about them in old reports. Creatures that had once been alive, once part of the jungle, but had been twisted by something unnatural. Their bodies were warped, their minds lost. The Veilthera did not speak of them often, only that they were a consequence of human greed. And now one was hunting them. Sylvain raised a hand. The group stopped. She turned slightly, speaking softly in the musical language of her people. The Veilthera around her moved quickly, positioning themselves in a loose circle. Their glowing eyes flickered, their bodies shifting like the jungle itself. Then she turned to Elias. "Stay silent." Elias swallowed and nodded. Not that he had much choice. The vines around him remained firm, but he could still move his head slightly. He watched as the shadows twisted again. And then it appeared. The creature that stepped from the darkness was once something natural, once part of this world. But now it was corrupt. Its body was warped wood and blackened vines, its form hunched and unnatural. What might have once been a face was now just a hollow gaping void. Its limbs twitched unnaturally, moving like a puppet on broken strings. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The revenant let out a low growl, its hollow mouth twisting into something like a snarl. The jungle around them grew even quieter. Even the wind stopped. Then, without warning, it lunged. The jungle fights back. The Veilthera moved instantly. Vines shot forward, wrapping around the revenant's limbs, but the creature ripped through them like paper. It moved fast, too fast. One of the Veilthera warriors leaped forward, her arms shifting into sharp, thorned tendrils. She struck, but missed. The revenant twisted, slamming into her with unnatural force. She was thrown back, hitting a tree with a sickening crack. Elias gritted his teeth. He could do nothing but watch. Sylvain stepped forward now, her glowing eyes narrowing. She lifted a hand, and the jungle answered. From the ground, thick roots burst upward, wrapping around the revenant's legs, dragging it down. The creature screeched, its hollow mouth opening wider as it struggled. But Sylvain didn't stop. The vines tightened, twisting around the revenant's body, forcing it lower, deeper, until it was nearly buried beneath the earth. The jungle itself swallowed it. Then silence. Elias let out a slow breath. The battle had lasted only moments, but he could still feel the tension in the air. The Veilthera around him stood still, watching the ground where the revenant had disappeared. Sylvain turned back to Elias, her expression unreadable. "Now you see," she said softly. Elias frowned. "See what?" She stepped closer, and this time, her voice carried something different. Not just caution, not just authority. Regret. What your people did to us. A broken promise. Elias stared at her, his mind racing. The revenants. The way the jungle had changed. The fear in the eyes of the Veilthera. He had read the reports. The stories of how humanity's corporations had once tried to tame Scytheria-9. They had tried to harvest its biotech secrets, ignoring the warnings of the Veilthera. And in doing so, they had created monsters. Elias clenched his jaw. That wasn't me. Sylvain tilted her head slightly. No, but you carry their name. Their blood. Elias exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to tell her he wasn't like the others, that he had come here to fix things. But before he could speak, she lifted a hand. The vines around him loosened. Not completely, but enough. Come, she said. If you truly seek the truth, you will see it with your own eyes. Elias took a deep breath and nodded. For the first time since he crashed, he was finally getting closer to the answers he came for, and he had a feeling the truth would change everything. Elias took a cautious step forward, feeling the damp earth beneath his boots. The vines had loosened just enough to let him walk, but not enough to let him forget. He was still a prisoner. Sylvain led the way, her movements smooth, almost effortless. The jungle obeyed her. Vines parted as she stepped through. Bioluminescent flowers leaned in her direction, and the roots beneath them shifted, guiding their path. Elias had spent years studying this planet's history. He had read about the living forest, how the Veilthera shared a deep connection with it. But seeing it with his own eyes, it was something else entirely. The other Veilthera followed closely, their glowing eyes flickering in the dim light. No one spoke. Even the jungle was quiet now, as if watching, waiting. Elias swallowed his questions for now. He knew better than to push too hard. He needed them to trust him. The forgotten place. They walked for what felt like an hour, deeper into the jungle, until the air changed again. It became heavier, not just thick with moisture, but with something else. A presence, a memory. Then Elias saw it. The jungle suddenly opened up into a wide circular clearing. At the center, massive stone ruins stood half-buried in thick roots, their surfaces covered in glowing moss. Strange symbols were carved into the stone. Not human, not Veilthera. Something older. Sylvain finally turned to face him. This is where your ancestor made his promise. Elias frowned. Promise. She gestured toward the ruins. Dr. Adrian Voss stood here, long before your people sent their machines. He swore to protect our world. He swore that no harm would come to it. Her glowing eyes darkened. And yet your kind broke that promise. Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had spent his life trying to understand what had happened to Adrian Voss, but there were so many missing pieces. He stepped closer to the ruins, running his fingers over the carvings. The stone was warm, not from the sun, but from something deeper, something alive. Then he noticed something strange. A marking, different from the others. A Terran insignia. His breath caught. His great-grandfather had carved this. And beneath it, faint but still visible, were words in old Terran script. The forest speaks. If you listen, you will know. Elias ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. What had Adrian Voss discovered here? What had he tried to protect? He turned back to Sylvain. What happened to him? She was silent for a moment. Then, softly, she said, he chose to stay. A choice made long ago. Elias's heart pounded. Stay. That didn't make sense. You're saying he survived? That he lived here? Sylvain nodded. For many years, he became part of the jungle, part of us. Elias felt his head spin. This changed everything. The official reports claimed Adrian Voss had died in an accident during early expeditions. But if he had survived, if he had chosen to disappear, why? He looked back at the ancient ruins, at the vines curling around them like protective arms. Something deep inside him whispered, because he knew something no one else did. Elias turned back to Sylvain. Where is he now? She hesitated. Then, for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her expression. Sadness. Come, she said. I will show you. The truth beneath the earth. The journey continued, but this time there was a difference. The air was heavier, the jungle quieter. Even the bioluminescent plants dimmed, as if mourning something unseen. Elias's pulse quickened. After several minutes, they reached another clearing. But this one was not like the last. A massive tree stood in the center. It was larger than anything Elias had ever seen. Ancient, towering, powerful. Its bark shimmered with a faint golden light, and its roots stretched outward like veins, weaving through the earth. And at its base, half buried beneath twisting vines, was a human skeleton. Elias stopped breathing. He didn't need anyone to tell him. He already knew. He stepped forward slowly, his legs suddenly heavy. His hands trembled as he reached out, brushing dirt from the old rusted nameplate resting beside the bones. The letters were faded, but he could still read them. Dr. Adrian Voss. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was it. This was where his great-grandfather's journey had ended. But why? He turned back to Sylvain. What happened to him? She looked at the tree, then back at Elias. Her voice was soft, but firm. He gave himself to the jungle. Elias stared at the bones of his great-grandfather, half buried beneath the roots of the enormous tree. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Dr. Adrian Voss hadn't died in a crash. He hadn't been lost in some accident. He had chosen to stay. The air around them was thick with silence. Even the jungle itself seemed to hold its breath. The Valethera warriors stood back, watching Elias with unreadable expressions. Only Sylvain remained close. Finally, Elias turned to her. His voice was hoarse. "What do you mean?" He gave himself to the jungle. Sylvain gazed at the great tree, her glowing green eyes reflecting its golden shimmer. "Your ancestor was different from the others. He did not come to take. He came to understand." She gestured to the towering tree. And when the time came, he made his choice. Elias swallowed hard. What choice? Sylvain's expression softened slightly. To become part of what he swore to protect. Elias took a slow, shaky breath. He had spent his entire life chasing the truth about Adrian Voss, and now that he had found it, it was more than he had ever imagined. But there were still pieces missing. He turned back to the massive tree, its golden bark pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The roots wrapped around his great-grandfather's remains, not consuming them, but cradling them, protecting them. A thought struck him. "You're saying he's still here?" Sylvain nodded. "In a way." Elias hesitated. It couldn't be possible. Could it? But deep inside, something in his gut told him that this jungle was far more alive than anything humanity had ever understood. His great-grandfather had believed that. And maybe, just maybe, he had been right. The whispering roots. Elias stepped closer to the tree. The golden light in its bark pulsed again, and for a brief moment, he felt something. A whisper. Not words, not a voice, but an impression. Memories. His breath caught. He turned to Sylvain. "Can I hear him?" Sylvain studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and placed a hand on the tree's bark. The golden glow brightened slightly, and the jungle around them hummed with quiet energy. "Place your hand here," she said. Elias hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out. The moment his fingers touched the tree, his mind exploded with light. Visions of the past. He wasn't in the jungle anymore. He was somewhere else. Flashes of images rushed through his mind, memories that weren't his. A man in a white coat, standing in this same clearing, surrounded by curious Valethera. His eyes filled with wonder as he touched the trees, as he learned their language, as he made a promise to protect them. Then, fire. Machines tearing through the jungle. The sound of trees being ripped apart. Screams. The Valethera fighting back. Adrian Voss standing between them, trying to stop the destruction, trying to keep his promise. But the damage had already been done. Something had changed that day. The jungle had suffered. The creatures that had once been part of it had twisted into something else. The revenants had been born. And Adrian. Elias saw his great-grandfather standing before the great tree, just as he was now. But he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The jungle had been dying, wounded by human greed. The only way to heal it was to become part of it. So Adrian Voss had made his final choice, and the jungle had accepted him. The last thing Elias saw was his great-grandfather smiling as the golden roots wrapped around him, pulling him into the embrace of the world he had come to love. Then, darkness. The awakening. Elias gasped, stumbling back as he broke contact with the tree. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged. The Veilthera watched him in silence. He turned to Sylvain, his hands shaking. "I saw him." She nodded. "Now you understand." Elias clenched his fists. He had spent years believing his great-grandfather had been a victim, that he had died alone on an alien world. But the truth was so much bigger. Adrian Voss had saved this place, and now it was Elias's turn to decide what to do with that knowledge. He looked back at the great tree, at the golden glow pulsing beneath its bark. His great-grandfather had given his life to protect this world. Elias wasn't sure if he could do the same, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let history repeat itself. Elias stood before the great tree, his heartbeat still unsteady. The visions had felt too real, not just memories, but something deeper. As if the jungle itself had reached into his mind and whispered its story. His great-grandfather, Adrian Voss, had made a choice to save this world. But what was Elias supposed to do now? The Veilthera warriors watched him in silence, their glowing eyes unreadable. Sylvain stood closest, waiting, as if she already knew the war raging inside him. Elias took a slow breath. He needed answers. Turning to Sylvain, he asked, "What happens now?" Her gaze flickered to the golden tree before returning to him. "Now you decide if you are truly different from the rest of your kind." The silent threat. Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" Sylvain's expression darkened. "Your people are coming." His stomach twisted. The Terran forces. They had never stopped trying to control this planet. If they knew he had survived, if they learned what he had discovered, they would never leave the jungle in peace. Elias felt a sharp wave of frustration. He had come here to study, to learn, not to bring destruction. But that didn't matter now. The jungle had given him the truth. And soon, it would face the same threat his great-grandfather had tried to prevent. He clenched his fists. "How long do we have?" Sylvain tilted her head, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she answered, "Less than a day." Elias cursed under his breath. That wasn't enough time. He turned, scanning the jungle. There had to be something. Some way to stop this before it was too late. But what? The jungle's voice. As he stood there, heart pounding, the golden tree pulsed again. A faint hum filled the air, like a whisper at the edge of his mind. Elias hesitated. Then, slowly, he placed his hand against the bark. A surge of energy rushed through him. This time, there were no visions, only feelings. The jungle was alive. It was not just a collection of trees and vines. It was one great mind, ancient and wise. It remembered everything. And now, it was speaking to him. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, focusing. "Show me how to save you." A warmth spread through his chest, and suddenly he knew. Not with words, but with instinct. The jungle was not powerless. It had survived destruction before. It could fight back. But it needed a voice. Someone to guide it. Someone to stand for it. Elias pulled his hand away, gasping. The golden light faded, but the knowledge remained. He turned to Sylvain, determination burning in his chest. "I know what to do." Preparing for the battle. The Veilthera listened as Elias explained. The jungle was not just a place. It was a force, one that could rise against the invaders if it was awakened. But it needed him to do it, Sylvain studied him for a long moment. Then she simply said, "Then we will help." The warriors moved quickly, vanishing into the jungle. They knew this land better than any Terran soldier ever could. If Elias was right, they wouldn't have to fight alone. The jungle itself would become their ally. Elias turned back to the great tree one last time. He thought of Adrian Voss, of the promise he had made so many years ago. Now it was his turn, and he would not fail. The first shadow falls. Hours passed, and the jungle changed. The vines stirred, their movements no longer random, but focused. The glowing plants pulsed with new energy, their colors shifting in waves. Even the air itself felt charged, as if the world was preparing for a storm. Then the first ship appeared. A sleek, black Terran gunship, cutting through the sky like a knife. It hovered above the trees, scanning, searching. Elias stood his ground, watching. The jungle waited. More ships followed, their engines humming in the distance. Soon, the invaders would land, believing this place was still theirs to take. They had no idea what was waiting for them. Elias took a deep breath. Then he reached out. Not with his hands, not with his voice, but with the connection the jungle had given him. And the jungle answered. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, deep and ancient. The vines began to move, weaving together like great serpents. The trees shifted, their massive trunks creaking. The very ground itself seemed to awaken, as if the planet was shaking off a deep sleep. The Terran soldiers had come expecting a jungle. What they had found was a living force. Elias clenched his fists, feeling the pulse of the world beneath him. This time, he whispered, "We fight back." The sky above the jungle darkened as more Terran gunships arrived, their engines roaring like distant thunder. The invasion had begun. Elias stood in the heart of the jungle, surrounded by Valethera warriors. The air around them pulsed with energy, the very trees and vines shifting, as if sensing the coming battle. They don't know what's waiting for them, Sylvain said, her glowing green eyes locked on the descending ships. Elias nodded. Let's make sure they never forget. The first strike. The first Terran drop pods crashed into the clearing with a metallic thud. Doors hissed open, and armored soldiers stepped out, scanning the jungle with cold efficiency. Secure the perimeter, their commander ordered. But the jungle was not a battlefield they could control. The moment the soldiers stepped forward, the ground shifted beneath them. Vines lashed out, wrapping around their legs. Massive roots erupted from the earth, knocking them off their feet. The trees themselves seemed to bend unnaturally, blocking their movements. Panic set in. The soldiers opened fire, their weapons spitting bright energy bolts into the jungle. But the jungle fought back. Thick vines snapped like whips, dragging men into the shadows. The ground split apart, swallowing some of them whole before sealing again like nothing had happened. The very air felt alive, pulsing with an unseen force that filled their minds with dread. It was not an ambush. It was a massacre. Elias felt the jungle's power surging through him. It was listening to him, responding to his will. He had become its voice, its champion. And for the first time in human history, the jungle was fighting back. The commander's mistake. High above, the Lid Terran commander, Captain Reynolds, watched from his hovering gunship. His soldiers were being torn apart. "What is this?" he muttered, his hands tightening into fists. "It's just trees and plants. How is this happening?" Then his scanners picked up something. A single human life sign. "Elias." Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "So, you're the one behind this." He turned to his pilot. "Prepare the shockwave cannons. If the jungle wants to fight, we'll burn it down. Fire against life." Elias looked up as the gunship descended, its cannons glowing with energy. His breath caught. They were going to destroy everything. For a brief second, he felt doubt creeping into his mind. Could the jungle really fight something like this? Then, a warm pulse of energy flowed through him. The jungle was not afraid. Neither should he be. Elias closed his eyes and reached out. The jungle answered. Nature's wrath. Suddenly, the air hummed with power. From deep within the jungle, something stirred. A great beast, made of vines, bark, and glowing golden energy, rose from the trees. It was massive, larger than the gunship itself. Its eyes burned like twin suns, and its limbs were formed from ancient roots as strong as steel. The jungle had given birth to a guardian. The Terran soldiers froze in terror. Even the commander hesitated, his hand hovering over the fire controls. Elias stepped forward, his voice ringing through the clearing. You should leave. Reynolds hesitated for only a second, then fired. A blinding shockwave burst from the gunship, tearing through the jungle. Trees shattered. The air burned. The ground trembled. But the guardian stood firm. With a mighty roar, it lashed out, slamming into the gunship with the force of a hurricane. The metal frame buckled, alarms screaming as the ship spun out of control. Reynolds barely had time to shout before his gunship was ripped from the sky, crashing into the jungle with a fiery explosion. The battle was over, and the jungle had won. The final choice. As the smoke cleared, the surviving Terran soldiers dropped their weapons. They knew they had lost. Elias stepped forward. He could feel the jungle still thrumming with power, waiting for his command. He could end this. He could erase them all. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, Go home. Tell them this planet is not theirs to take. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They ran, disappearing into the wreckage of their fallen ships. Sylvain watched them leave, then turned to Elias. You spared them. Elias exhaled. My great-grandfather didn't come here to destroy. He came to protect. He looked around at the jungle, the trees, the vines, the glowing energy that had become a part of him. So will I. A new beginning. As the sun rose over the jungle, Elias knew he would never return to the life he once had. Earth, the Terran Empire, they were no longer his home. This place was. The jungle had given him a gift, and he would spend the rest of his life protecting it. Far above, the last of the Terran ships vanished into the sky, carrying a message back to Earth. This world belonged to the jungle, and it always would.